Now, at the top of the show, I told you what a disgrace this COVID pandemic inquiry is. The pathetic sham announced by Prime Minister Anthony Albanese today. The inquiry, limited as it is, without Royal Commission powers, actually specifically excludes the state decisions from any examination. That's extraordinary. The states locked people down. The states imposed curfews. They took away liberties and had people arrested for being in the park or not wearing masks outdoors or even for dissenting online. The states enforced vaccine mandates and restricted travel, and they imposed harsh and cruel border closures. Remember the callousness? We covered it from all angles here. Last night I spoke to a devastated man, Mark Killian, who, along with his wife Anneli, have flown home from the US only to be denied entry to Queensland to say goodbye to Mark's dying dad.
I think everyone understands what that feels like, to be able to see your father one last time and say goodbye.
Last week, we covered the story of a Melbourne couple stuck in Brisbane hotel quarantine, refused the right to even see their premature newborn baby, who was in the same hospital. Publican Paul Dimatino, who's campaigned for a year against onerous pandemic measures. Dimma, how are you coping with this fourth lockdown?
Chris, it's wearing us down again. The anguish, the angst and the uncertainty with our staff is, it's not great at the moment.
It's been hard. It's been about 6 months. I went back for a job 6 months back and then was waiting for borders to open to come back and see Mum for Christmas.
Stringent border closures and rules between Victoria and South Australia means the family of five will go for weeks, even months, without seeing each other.
You just get disheartened because every time you try and do that, there's just a massive process.
When I spoke with the Shadow Health Minister, Anne Ruston, I said this was a disgrace, this inquiry, and I wondered what the opposition could do about it.
Well, look, Chris, you're absolutely right. To have an inquiry that doesn't have... it doesn't compel the states and territories to participate in it is just a joke. It's not a half an inquiry. It's not really an inquiry at all. And the contempt that the Prime Minister is holding Australians in to suggest that he's just going to hold an inquiry into what the coalition government did federally during the pandemic completely and utterly ignores the consequences of so many decisions by states and territories that had really significant impacts on the lives and livelihoods of Australians. So we will certainly be continuing to make sure that we call out Mr Albanese for another broken promise and another contemptuous display towards the Australian public.
Yeah, there's no doubt that the Royal Commission, federal government couldn't force a Royal Commission on the states, but at the very least, they could have a national inquiry that is charged, the terms of reference say, have a look at how the whole nation dealt with this and compare the results and the measures state by state.
Well, they certainly could have done more than what they announced today. I mean, what they announced today can be described as nothing more than pathetic. But the other question I think that Australians need to be asking, particularly those people that live in Queensland and Victoria, which are where the two premiers that we understand are pushing back against this are, is they should be asking those premiers, what have you got to hide? Why won't you let Australia, and particularly people who live in that state, have some transparency about the actions that they took during the pandemic. The actions that saw Victoria be the most lockdown, or Melbourne be the most lockdown city in the world, where we saw people, because of border closures between states and territories, weren't able to see loved ones when they were dying. I mean, there were some really horrific stories that came out of COVID. And these states are just refusing to allow any sunlight on it. I mean, there's some pretty big questions to be asked of the state premiers over this too.
Well, yeah, I'll get to that because that's crucial. They can't be let off the hook. They should be having state royal commissions. But if you look at what the Prime Minister's done here, it's obvious he's caved into those state premiers. Rather than taking them on, he's just backed off and said that the federal inquiry won't look into the states. He should have done the opposite. A national leader would have said, we need a proper national royal commission. He should have called publicly on the states to have letters patent to agree to a national royal commission so that the whole country could look at every measure that was adopted to find out what went right, what went wrong, and what on earth we should do next time.
Absolutely, unquestionably. And, this is just clearly a protection racket that's being run by the Prime Minister because he's too scared to take on his state and territory counterparts. And don't forget, the mainland Australia is all the same colour as Mr Albanese's government, so they're supposed to all be on the same team. And for him to be so pathetic in his response and deny the Australian public the opportunity to be able to have a look at this, really does speak to the character of our Prime Minister, I think.
Yeah, well, we will learn nothing from this inquiry. You can see what it's going to announce. It'll talk about quarantine measures and vaccine rollouts, and that's about all. What can you do in federal parliament to try and push for something better? Is there a chance, for instance, that you could get a motion through the Senate demanding some sort of a stronger inquiry, or in fact initiating a stronger inquiry in the Senate?
Well, I'd like to think that in discussions with the crossbench that we might be able to force that, and even the Greens, because, as I say, this is a protection racket that's being run by the Labor Party. It's not necessarily something that I would have thought that the Greens or the crossbench would have been supportive, but we do need to remember that anything that we really force an issue on, the Labor Party have got the numbers in the House of Representatives. But, the other thing that sticks in my craw, Chris, is the fact that, there is no real need in this inquiry for the actions of the Albanese Labor government in the last 16 months, because COVID didn't stop on the 22nd of May 2022. COVID's still in our community. We've seen really high rates of people dying in aged care, and more people have died in aged care in the first 8 months of the Albanese government that died in the first 2 years of the pandemic. We've seen plummeting vaccination rates. So, the Albanese government, really is playing Australia for mugs. They're only going to look into the time of the coalition when we had COVID, ignoring their own involvement or their own response to COVID and ignoring the state's response. So, but hopefully we'll be able to convince the crossbench to do something. It's a pretty disappointing and sad day for Australia that the government would actually do this to a country about the most important and impactful.
Exactly. And think about what Australians put up with, the way our liberties were crushed, the hardship, the deaths, the separation, and to not have a proper inquiry is an absolute disgrace. There's only one Liberal state government, that's Tasmania. Should they at least initiate a thorough Royal Commission and set the example so we can put pressure on other states and the federal government to follow?
Well, look, I'd be really interested to see what the Tasmanian government's response is today to this action by the federal government to completely ignore states and territories, and it would be good to have somebody come out and actually say to the Prime Minister this isn't good enough. But I'd also call on all of those sectors that were really, really hardly hit by COVID. They should be demanding that the federal government comes out and looks into what the states and territories are doing, because you've got to look at lots of sectors, whether it be the aged care sector, the health sector, the tourism sector. Everybody was impacted, schools, families, and I think the Australian public should be demanding of the federal government to actually lift its game here, because
Absolutely.
They've just been completely done over by this decision.
I couldn't agree more, and I think the complaining about this and the push against this decision has only just begun. Thanks so much for joining us, Anne.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Chris.